Good evening. I'm Brendan James Murray, the author of Venom, the heroic search for Australia's deadliest snake. And I'm going to be speaking this evening about Kevin Budden because today, as many of you will know, the 28th of the 7th, is the 70-year anniversary of Kevin Budden's death as the result of a taipan snake bite, a snake that he was attempting to capture to assist with the development of a taipan antivenom. Of course, when this happened to Kevin, there were no taipans whatsoever in captivity. So it was a great sacrifice that he made, and he's certainly a key figure, I think, in Australian scientific history, herpetological history, and just in Australian history generally. I really want to put out big thanks to Chris Williams from the Australian Herpetological Society for inviting me to give this talk, and also just to the Australian Herpetological Society generally, and really all the people within the herpetological community who I've met over the last few years. I'm a writer, I'm not a herpetologist, I'm not a reptile expert, but I've found the people within the community have been really open, really fantastic, friendly. I've made some great friends along the way, people like Barry Goldsmith, a lot of others that I could name. And I've just found the herpetological community to be a really, really good bunch of people. So I thank you for that, because to a large degree, it wouldn't have been without your help. Well, I needed your help, otherwise the book wouldn't have been written. And I also want to just highlight, I suppose, the connection between current herpetologists, whether they be professional or amateur herpetologists, and Kevin Budden, because of course it was Kevin Budden and Roy McKay who set up the Australian Reptile Club back in the late 1940s that grew eventually into the Australian Herpetological Society and expanded from there into other herpetological societies around the country. So you are very much a part of Kevin Budden's legacy and the legacy of all those early herpetologists who were really doing things that were groundbreaking at the time. There was so much that wasn't known back then about the fauna, the herpetofauna of Australia. And many of you, I just want to acknowledge, are taking, and I suppose it's not something we talk about a lot, but taking risks as Kevin Budden was. For example, I know many of you or some of you work to remove snakes from people's properties. So doing that as a part of obviously helping the community, but helping the reptiles as well. So there's that connection too. One of the great things I think for me over the last few years has been the real interest that's developed in the history surrounding Kevin Budden and his story in the herpetological community. Some people I've found knew the story well, particularly some of the older people who've been involved in herpetology for a longer period of time. But gradually, I think Kevin's story is getting around, and maybe one of the highlights for me was when Will Kemp sent me a picture of his son, who actually dressed up as Kevin Budden for a school event, an event at his school, and that showed to me that people are starting to really appreciate what Kevin Budden did. Another great thing is that the interest has sort of gone beyond the herpetological community and just into the broader community, which has been great. So ABC's Conversations did an episode where I talked, about other things connected with the story as well, but in a lot of detail about Kevin Budden. ABC's Off Track program has shown an interest, and even just this morning I got a message from Michael, who runs the Forgotten Australia podcast, and he's doing an On This Day podcast, and he's dedicated an episode to Kevin Budden as well. So you can track that down and have a listen to it. And I think this is really the way that it should be, because Kevin shouldn't be just some distant historic figure that we gradually forget about. He's significant. He's important. What he did was important, and we need to talk about him and make sure that he is remembered. And what better time, of course, than on the 70th anniversary of his death. It's interesting as well. I was thinking about this coming up to doing this presentation, thinking about how to approach it, and it's interesting. Down here in Victoria, where I am, once more we're in a lockdown with the coronavirus pandemic, and it was kind of, in a strange way, it made me think of Kevin Budden and his friends going out and attempting to catch taipans in the late 40s and early 50s, because back then, as many of you will know, taipans were killing a lot of people, more people, in fact, than I think some realise. There are quite a number of deaths at that time, particularly in and around the cane fields. And it was this threat to health, life and safety that was somewhat invisible, or it seemed so, to the people who were falling prey to it. And it was the scientific community that was sort of required to step in and do something about that, take some action in regards to that. And I think we can see the obvious parallels there between what scientists, I guess, are doing now, scrambling to create a vaccine for the coronavirus, which seems the only way things are going to go back to normal is when that vaccine is completed. In the same way, in the late 40s and early 50s, for people to feel safe, particularly cane farmers, the only way that was really going to happen was with the development of a taipan antivenom, and that was really Kevin Budden's number one objective and number one goal. We talk a lot, I think, about loss, of course, when people pass away, and certainly when they pass away prematurely, as Kevin Budden did. But I don't think at times we really think about what that means, or we don't think about what it means as deeply as we could. And I remember some years ago, I was at an Anzac Day, Anzac service, and there was a guy there, I can't remember who he was, but he gave this great speech about the sacrifices that the soldiers, Navy, Army and Air Force had made during our wars, and he was focusing on loss. And he talked about the idea that young people losing their lives in these kinds of contexts, you think about what they're losing, they're losing everything. You think of every experience that you've had in your life, every person you've met, every meal that you've eaten, every movie that you've watched, everything you've done, that is all lost. And we need to remember, I think, that Kevin Budden was a very, very young man. He was only 20 years old. He hadn't had many experiences yet in his life. And we can sort of measure, I think, what was lost, not so much in terms of what Kevin Budden was, but what he could have been. And I think most people in the herpetological community would agree that had Kevin survived, so had he not been killed, there's no question he would have become a giant of herpetology and probably a giant within the scientific community generally. I mean, if he potentially, had he not been bitten, could be still alive today. He'd be, he'd be 89 or 90. And it could well be that rather than me sort of sitting here giving this presentation, it may actually have been Kevin Budden himself talking about the 70th anniversary of the day when he famously caught the first taipan that got the antivenom program ticking over, and as we know, ultimately resulted in the saving of many lives. But of course, none of that was to be, because he was bitten by the snake and he did lose his life 70 years ago today. What I really like to focus on when I'm talking to people about Kevin Budden is what his objectives were, what his aims were. And I suppose I don't just include Kevin Budden in that. There are many other of those herpetologists of the era, people like John Dwyer, Roy Mackay, Neville Goddard, and I could go on, what their actual core objective was. And I really do believe, although they were fascinated by the animals and wanted to learn more about them, I really believe that it was primarily the humanitarian aim. They had the goal to contribute to this antivenom being developed so that human lives could be saved. So in that sense, it was a very, very selfless goal that they had, and a very selfless aim that Kevin Budden had, that ultimately caused him to lose his life. And I think it's important for us to keep coming back to that fact, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more further on when I talk about a few of the events surrounding the day of his death and some of the questions that have been raised around that. So Kevin, I think, it would be fair to say, pretty naive. I think he knew in an intellectual sense that he was risking his life and that he could be killed, but he was a big believer in snake fright, the idea that you don't die from the venom, but that you die from the shock and panic, which, given what we know now about just how toxic taipan venom is, that suggests a degree of naivety, and many of us would know that Brian Fry managed to find samples of Budden's snake's venom years and years and years later, and it was still extremely toxic then, and I believe capable of killing people. So there was that naivety, but he understood the seriousness. And what I wanted to do, because I know some people listening will have read Venom, there was so much, like piles and piles of stuff that I didn't include in the book. I wanted to include some of that stuff, or I try to include some of that stuff each time, so you get something a little bit new. And I just picked out just 3 articles that just give a sense of the fact that Kevin Budden did know what risks he was taking, because he was very aware. He, along with Roy Mackay, they'd really done a lot of research. Although they hadn't seen taipans before, they knew the history, they knew what had been going on. So this I've picked 3. They're quite short. The first is the longest. I'm just going to read 3 historical newspaper articles. This one's from Saturday the 24th of March, 1906, from the Telegraph in Brisbane. The heading is Death from Snakebite. News reached town on Saturday afternoon of the death of a young man named Edward Alexander Fraser from snakebite, says the Mackay Standard of 19th of March. It appears that between 11 and 12 o'clock on Saturday morning, the deceased, who was working at his brother's farm near, and I actually can't read that, some of these old articles are hard to read, but was bitten on the calf of his left leg by a snake. So far as we can ascertain, some little time elapsed before any active measures were taken to deal with the case, but when its serious nature made itself evident, the place was searched and the wound vigorously sucked. In the meantime, Mr. James Reed, engineer at Farley, conveyed the news to Dr. Horace, I think it might be, who lost no time in driving to the place. On arriving shortly after 2 o'clock, the deceased was evidently in a most serious condition, and though evidence were made to bring him around, the unfortunate young man gradually sank and expired at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So based on that timeline, you're looking at what seems to be a very relatively young, fit man in North Queensland who's bitten by a snake and is dead 3 hours later. Again, it may well not have been a taipan, but this is the type of thing Budden and Roy Mackay and all those guys were aware of and were looking at and understood. A second one is from Saturday the 20th of December 1913. This is the Bowen Independent. I think this one's much more likely to be a taipan, I think. Death from snake bite. A sad death is reported from Ayr as the result of a snake bite. Mr. C. Amos, who has a farm on the Inkerman lands, was assisting his brother to drive out some horses who had broken the fence and got in among the young cane. The snake bit him on the ankle and the wound was at once cut and bled and permanganate of potash used. The train was caught into air from Home Hill, but the sufferer died on Thursday night, leaving a wife and 5 children to mourn his loss. So again, situated, I suppose, in the cane fields in that part of the world, fairly rapid death by the sound of it, of a fairly healthy guy. You'd be sort of pondering whether a taipan could be involved. And one more, an article from 2nd of February 1929, Bowen Independent. It is our sad duty to have to record the death of a little son of Albert Foote, Kelsey Creek, aged 12 years, which took place on Monday night last as a result of snake bite. We learned that a brown snake crawled up one of the boy's legs on Saturday last and bit him 3 times. Once more, I think reading these sorts of things, being aware of these sorts of things really did motivate and inspire Budden and others to really want to develop that antivenom, in some sense to protect the community. Of course, they initially went north to Coen in far north Queensland. That was Roy Mackay, Kevin Budden and Neville Goddard, and they didn't find any taipans. It was a failed search. However, while they were up there, Roy Mackay actually kept some really, really meticulous diaries. I'm just going to read a few very short extracts from that, again, to give a bit of a sense of what Kevin Budden's life was like in the lead up to his death. So this was sort of the big trip he went on just before he did die. Short extract here that I'll read. We arrived at South Brisbane Station at 2:43 p.m. I rang Mr. Wassell and he came to the station to pick us up about 15 minutes later in an ex-Army Hillman utility, which he has used for travelling around the Cape York. He took us to the museum where we had a look around and we were introduced to Mr. Vernon, a taxidermist whom I met in Sydney a couple of years ago. The museum has one pickled specimen of a taipan about 8 feet long, collected at Colosseum, North Queensland. And in addition to this diary, which Roy Mackay was kind enough to give me copies of, I obviously also interviewed him at great length, and very sadly we lost him as well last year. And it really does seem like some of those really classic, absolutely central figures of early Australian herpetology we've lost recently. Another one, of course, being a good friend of mine, John Dwyer, who's really significant in the taipan story. And even George Rosendale, who survived the taipan bite in 1949, passed away last year as well. Just highlights, I think, the importance of speaking to these guys and girls while they're still around. Another little extract that I'll read. So again, this is Roy Mackay talking about that earlier expedition. Let me see. Okay, so about a quarter of an hour later, we collected 6 specimens of the freshwater snake. And it looks like he's got the scientific name there as Natrix mayuru, it might be. It's a bit hard to read the old cursive. They were from 1 foot to 18 inches long. They varied from almost black with lighter shaded spots to pink and orange with greenish spots. The scales are keeled and there is some resemblance in the head to that of the common green tree snake. The weather was wet. In fact, the rain was consistent all day. I was told later by Dr. Flecker it was the second wettest day for the year. We came back to camp and put the catch in a small flour bag. Kevin came into camp later with a specimen of the whip snake, like the one I captured. It was a little larger than mine and measured about 16 inches. We showed the reptiles to the workers on the zoo reconstruction. So once again, I think this real adventure that Kevin had been on in those final days of his life. One final one that I'll read. Let me see. Bell was able to show McLennan the rare eclectus parrot, in which the male is red and the female is green. This is actually Roy writing about McLennan, who actually found the first taipans, very early specimens, hence why it was originally, I think might have been Pseudechus McLennani back then for a while. You might correct me on that one. He called these birds. They did not manage to... Let me see that. Not managed to collect a bird supposed to have never been collected, yet which Bell knew of, that inhabited the rocky scrub. McLennan was very ill with TB, and a Dr. Patterson, who resided in Cohen in those days, attended him. Bell was with McLennan when he collected the 2 taipans, now in the Australian Museum collection. So, if you want to find out more about these diaries, you can always just get in touch. Get in touch through maybe through Chris Williams, and I might even be able to sort of scan these into an electronic document if people are interested in having a look. So I need to get now, I suppose, to the events of the 28th of July 1950, or the 27th of July 1950, I should say, because Kevin was bitten the day before he died. Now, there's some confusion over precisely when he died, in terms of, was it the morning, was it the evening? There's some conflicting evidence there, but I mean, I don't see that it's really significant. But certainly the day he was bitten by the snake. I know many people know the details, so I'll just run through it very quickly. So he was in Cairns alone, looking for taipans, staying at the museum. He received a note suggesting that there may have been a taipan at the Cairns rubbish dump. He went out there, found a taipan under a piece of fibro, managed to get it behind the head. He had his snake bag with him, but being alone, felt that he couldn't get it into the bag. So he hitchhiked along the Edge Hill Road, was picked up by a truck driver who took him to Ernie Stevens' house. Ernie Stevens was a naturalist friend that Budden had made in Cairns. And while trying to get the snake into a bag with Ernie's help, the snake bit Kevin. He was hospitalised and subsequently died when the iron lung was insufficient to actually promote his breathing. Again, I know I've mentioned this in the book and elsewhere, but a big acknowledgement to Dr. David Williams. Many of you, I'm sure, have looked at his website, King Snake. I think it's King Snake. You can Google it anyhow. And he just provided some really, really good information about some of what happened that day. So yeah, big thanks to David for that. And of course, we all know about the awesome work that he's done in PNG, no doubt contributing to the saving of a lot of lives over there too, and in that sense, continuing Budden's legacy. But there's this kind of question of what really happened that day, or how can we interpret what happened that day? And just this afternoon, it sort of came up where, as I say, doing an interview on this day, one of the questions that was put to me was, well, was Kevin Budden reckless? And in some ways that is a fair question, because I suppose people might hear the story and think, well, what he did was really crazy. But my thoughts are that we can't look at Kevin Budden as reckless. I think that's an unfair way to look at him. And it's a temptation, I think, sometimes, and I found this with history generally, there's a temptation to look at the past from a modern perspective. And it would be the easiest thing in the world to look back on what Kevin did, how he attempted to catch the snake, how he attempted to bag the snake, etc., and observe that if someone were to do that today, they'd probably be judged quite harshly. But we're talking about an era where, I mean, it was 1950. There was no internet. There was no YouTube. There was nothing. There wasn't even a herpetological society, except that for the one that these guys had set up. You think of even the books that they had then on venomous snakes were largely, I mean, pictures that they had in a lot of cases would have been illustrations rather than photographs. So I think it's probably unfair of us to look back on Kevin and say, well, you know, what he did was reckless. It was a very different time. And of course, he had only the best motivations. Another interesting possibility that somebody raised with me once, somebody from that era, they said to me that their opinion was that Kevin actually could have bagged the snake at the rubbish tip, but he chose to hitchhike with it because he thought that would make a great news story, and that partly it was sort of motivated by the showman in him, if you like. Again, I really don't think that's the case. I think that's a sort of it's just speculation, really, and I don't think that that's really fair. I think what happened was that Kevin had never seen a taipan before. He got a hold of the taipan. It was not what he expected. I think it behaved differently from what he expected. We know, a lot to do with various snakes, but never a taipan before. He wasn't a big guy, and it was quite a big snake. He was completely by himself. And I really think that to some degree, although he kept a level head, he was a little bit panicked by the situation he found himself in. And what he wanted to do, which was the best thing that he could do, was get to his friend Ernie for assistance. And there was no other way to get there but on foot, because he didn't have his own vehicle and wouldn't have been able to drive it anyway. So the act of hitchhiking was just a way, I think, to speed that up. So I think we need to look back on Kevin Budden's death as a tragic accident that befell somebody who was really doing the very best that he could in the circumstances for the very best reasons. And I think he needs to be remembered as such. We know that Budden's taipan didn't live for very long after, in fact, it died not long after Kevin Budden did. And that was a real wasted opportunity. It wasn't properly looked after, which is a real shame. And I think even by the standard of the day, it wasn't well looked after. They had it locked in a safe at one point, which is bizarre and unthinkable, really. I mean, even for someone like myself, who's not a herpetologist, not a reptile keeper, I mean, common sense just alone dictates that a safe is no place for a living thing. But they did manage to milk it a couple of times, and the fact that it was only a few times, I don't think it renders Budden's sacrifice irrelevant, because what was so important was the symbolic significance of what Kevin Budden did. It really inspired other people, I think, other herpetologists specifically, to get out there and follow his lead and attempt to continue his legacy. And of course, as I've said, one of those was my good friend John Dwyer, and we know worked with Eric Worrell and others to attempt to capture taipans, and was able to with great heroics. I mean, one of the most extraordinary stories, I think, to come out of that whole period, which was really, in many ways, it was absolutely a golden age of Australian herpetology, where there was so much new ground still to be walked, so much possibility for adventure. The story that stands out, John Dwyer catching the 8-foot taipan by the tail and swinging it around using centrifugal force to prevent it from biting him, and that snake eventually being captured and making a massive contribution in terms of venom to the Antivenom program. And in that sense, it's Kevin Budden, it's John Dwyer, it's all those guys, but really it was Kevin Budden who started it, that allowed that antivenom to be produced and save its first life in late 1955, when it was administered to the 10-year-old boy Bruce Stringer, who was bitten while playing at the back of his school at Freshwater, and Bruce grew up himself to become a doctor, so that legacy even continues from there. So I suppose the main thing in remembering Kevin Budden and acknowledging his sacrifice 70 years down the track is to sort of ask that question of, well, where does that leave us today? I really believe that Kevin Budden's grave should almost be a kind of pilgrimage site for Australian herpetologists. If you're a part of that field, or if you're passionate or interested in that field, I think at some point you need to get out there and visit Kevin Budden's grave and pay your respects, because not only what he did for the entire community, and what he sacrificed for the entire community, but what he did for herpetology. Because of course, again, it was him and his friends who were the reason that the Australian Herpetological Society and other herpetological societies exist. Because way back then, when nobody was doing anything about it, they got it off the ground and they got it started. And I think he represents, in many ways, a lot of the best things about the herpetological community in Australia. The friendship, the selflessness, the preparedness to take risks if necessary in the pursuit of knowledge, scientific advancement, helping people out. I think Kevin just kind of captures that really, really well. It's been a while since I've been up there to visit his grave. And the last time I did was when I was working on the book, and the grave back then was looking pretty barren, pretty neglected. And given that obviously Kevin never had any children of his own, his kind of memory needs to be carried forward, I think, by the herpetological community. And I know acknowledgement here to Michael Cermak up there, who I believe has sort of gone to some lengths to try to organise something for the anniversary. Keep an eye on the grave, maybe look after it, maintain it a little bit. I think that's really important, rather than it kind of just becoming what it looked a little bit like when I was there, which is just this kind of lonely, forgotten, insignificant kind of grave. But of course, anyone who stops and looks closely and reads the plaque will see that there is a real amazing story behind that grave and the young man who lies beneath it. But yeah, big shout out to Michael Cermak and anyone else up in that part of the world who's interested in, particularly at the moment, given the anniversary, who's interested in maybe paying a visit to the grave and paying some respects. More broadly than that, I think we just need to make sure, and especially people within the herpetological community need to make sure that they tell the story, tell people about Kevin Budden, what he did, what he sacrificed, explain to them that he's a really key figure in Australian history and Australian science, and whether you're interested in reptiles or not, there are a great many lessons we can take from Kevin Budden. Lessons about putting others before ourselves, lessons about pursuing our passions, because that was another thing that he did absolutely. He was passionate about reptiles and he put everything into that. Again, I mean, he and Neville Goddard were hoping to start their own reptile park. And once more, if Kevin hadn't passed away, maybe that would have happened. But a lot of lessons that can be taken out of the Kevin Budden story and who Kevin Budden was. So I'll wrap it up there, I think. Thanks so much to you all for listening. And as I say, on this 70th anniversary of Kevin Budden's death, it's a good time just to take pause and think about what he sacrificed and what the herpetological community and the broader Australian community can take out of that, as we ensure that we continue his legacy. So thanks, everyone. All the best. Look after yourselves and stay safe.